Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 616, and today is June 17th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to cover on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into it. Just want to remind everyone to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And of course, it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Let's get into the news today. The first story up here we have at antiwar.com from Edward Hasbrook, and it's titled, Congress Moves Towards Automatic Registration for a Military Draft. So he writes, a proposal to expand registration for a possible military draft to young women as well as young men is moving forward again this year in Congress, along with a seductively simple seeming but in practice unfeasible proposal which will switch the current system in which young men are required to register for the Selective Service System, the SSS, to a system in which the SSS tries to identify and locate everyone eligible for a future draft and automatically register them based on other existing federal databases from the Social Security Administration, IRS, or U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. On Friday, both the U.S. Armed Services Committee and the full House of Representatives approved different proposals to expand or make it harder to avoid the requirement for men ages 16 to 26 to register for the Selective Service System for a potential military draft. The House vote was 217 to 199. The proposal for the changes to the Selective Service legislation were approved during consideration of the Senate and House versions of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2025. That'll be the NDAA 2025, which is considered a must-pass annual bill and typically runs more than 1,000 pages. And so they always cram so much into this bill because they say, oh, we have to fund the Pentagon. And so, this is going to be a near $1 trillion bill with also a lot of other language and legislation in it that, has a lot of different powers and gives the government different abilities to do stuff. So, the Senate Armed Services Committee approved a version of the NDAA that would expand the Selective Service registration to include young women as well as young men. This version of the NDAA will now go to the floor as a starting point for consideration and approval by the full Senate. Also on June 14th, the House of Representatives approved a different version of the NDAA that would make the Selective Service registration automatic while keeping it for men only. And so there was a House amendment proposed by Representative Warren Davison, a Republican from Ohio and a West Point graduate and an Army veteran, which would have replaced the provision to make the draft registration automatic with a provision that repeals the Military Selective Service Act, which was made in order by the Rules Committee to be considered or voted on by it was deemed not in order by the Rules Committee of the House, and so it wasn't voted on, which, is pretty disappointing but unsurprising. Typically how it works is both the House and the Senate pass different versions of their NDAAs, and then it'll go to conference committee, in which anything that somebody like me would have wanted in the bill gets stripped out, and anything that promotes the war state gets left in. Or, things even added at the end that's just, really stuffing the bill full of pork and things like that for the congressional leadership. Next up here, House Pentagon bill includes provision preventing indefinitely detention of Americans. So Patrick Eddington at Cato writes, over a decade ago, Congress passed and President Barack Obama signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2012, which became public law. And Section 1021B of that mammoth bill included language allowing U.S. military forces to indefinitely detain anyone who, quote, planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2021, or harbored those responsible of the attacks, as well as a person who was a part of or substantially supported Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces that are engaged in hostilities against the U.S. or its coalition partners, including any person that who has committed a belligerent act or has directly supported such hostilities in aid of such enemy forces, is the second clause, which is identified terms of aided and supported and associated force that set off alarm bells among civil liberty defenders, with someone who posted something online suggesting the Taliban military operations against coalition forces were an act of self-defense be considered aiding or supporting the Taliban. In much more contemporary context, an American who is outraged at the mass civilian casualties in Gaza as a result of the Israeli military action would be viewed as aiding or supporting Hamas, a State Department designated terrorist organization. So ever since Section 1021B was enacted, there have been attempts to repeal or modify the language. This afternoon, the latest attempt that was led by Representative Matt Rosendale, he is the Republican representative from Montana, seceded when his amendment to the 2025 NDAA was adopted by voice vote. Rosendale's amendment, if it survives the House Senate NDAA conference and remains in the bill, would prohibit American military forces from indefinitely detaining U.S. citizens under Section 1021B. So it looks like a victory, although, as I said, we are going to have to get through the conference committee, which I think is likely where they will try to strip this out. All right, let's get into some articles that I wrote yesterday. This one for antiwar.com, June 16th. NATO to control Ukraine aid to Trump-proof arms shipments. So, the U.S. took a significant step towards preventing a future American president from curtailing weapons transfers to Ukraine by allowing NATO to coordinate the arms shipments. Washington and some of its allies are concerned that former President Donald Trump will end military aid and seek a diplomatic settlement to the war should he return to office. The bloc adopted a new policy during a meeting of NATO defense ministers on Friday, and so according to a NATO press release, with a command in Germany, NATO will coordinate training and equipment donations with nearly 700 personnel from allied partner nations involved in this effort. NATO will also facilitate equipment logistics and provide support to the long-term development of Ukraine's armed forces. So the Dutch foreign minister explained that the bloc took this step as the war may grind on for some time, adding that coordination of arms shipments through Brussels will help prevent any country from altering its policy. So she said it's to make it proof to any situation, observing that Russia's war might go on for years. She added, so you want to have something in place that does not depend on specific persons, ministers, or whoever, which I got to take a second to point out here, right? That this is a war that they claim is being fought on behalf of democracy, right? And yet, when it comes to the American people deciding to vote for a president, whether that's Trump, RFK Jr., or any other leader, maybe it's the Hungarians voting for Orban, or other European leaders who may be against this war. They're trying to say, if the people change their minds and vote against this war that we want to make sure that this war continues anyway. And so initially what NATO wanted to happen was for all these countries to pledge by their own law. So the US would, I guess, have to pass a treaty or something like that to keep their current rate of funding to Ukraine for the next 10 years. So if that's $40 billion, $50 billion or so in the US, that's the level of aid that we would continue keeping over the course of the next 10 years. Obviously, that's a massive pool of money. But not only that, this money would be committed to NATO, and then NATO would be responsible, and the U.S. has a lot of authority and everything over NATO. NATO would be responsible for like buying the equipment and deciding what goes to Ukraine and when. And so this is giving a lot of power away, transferring it from Washington to Brussels. I think the American people should be a little bit concerned about that. So one NATO official told the AFP that the move was to prevent Trump from changing U.S. policy. The official stated, "It is about Trump-proofing, and that's what Stoltenberg says, protecting it from the winds of political change. Any U.S. president can pull the plug on it tomorrow." And again, they're saying the winds of political change. That's the will of the people. That's what this war is allegedly being fought over on behalf of Ukraine, is to defend the will of the Ukrainian people. And yet they're, just absorbing all the will of the Western people for this war. So on the campaign trail, Trump pledged to end the war within 24 hours of returning to office, but has failed to explain how he plans to achieve that promise. And as you guys know, I'm not particularly optimistic that he would do that. Additionally, the former president gave his political support to the $95 billion foreign military aid bill signed in April, which included over $60 billion for Ukraine, helping to break the deadlock in Congress. Still, Trump's statements about ending the war has caused concern among NATO members and Ukraine. President Zelensky recently asserted that Trump would become a loser president if he tried to end the conflict and would make America very weak. In addition to agreeing to funnel all arms to Ukraine through NATO, the defense ministers agreed to step up intelligence sharing with Ukraine and discuss the ongoing adaptation of NATO's nuclear capabilities. Stoltenberg said, "We are a nuclear alliance committed to being responsible and transparent, but clear in our resolve to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression." While the NATO chief did not provide details about what nuclear adaptations the bloc could be making, in recent months, both Sweden and Poland have expressed interest in hosting NATO nuclear weapons. All right, next up here, NATO, 500,000 troops on high readiness for war with Russia. So, an official with the North Atlantic Alliance says the bloc has exceeded its goal of placing 300,000 soldiers on standby for a potential war with Russia. The announcement comes as NATO members significantly escalated support for Ukraine, bringing the alliance closer to direct war with Moscow. So on Thursday, a NATO official told the AFP that member states have 300,000 soldiers ready to deploy for combat with Russia in the space of 30 days. The quote is, "The offer on the table from allies comfortably exceeds the 300,000 we said. Those forces which allies have said to us, they're available to you as of now at the level of readiness." So initially, we saw the 300,000 benchmark, but then NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg made an interesting statement the day after, suggesting the number was actually 500,000. So this is Stoltenberg's quote: "Allies are offering forces to NATO's command at a scale not seen in decades. Today we have 500,000 troops at high readiness across all domains, significantly more than the goal that was set at the 2022 Madrid summit," he said. The alliance hit the goal as its members have significantly ratcheted up support for Kiev in recent weeks. The U.S. and several other allied nations have recently given a green light for Ukraine to use their weapons to strike targets inside of Russia. The Netherlands and Denmark plan to supply Kiev with F-16s in the coming months and say the advanced aircraft could be used to bomb Russia. Stoltenberg added that he welcomes the policy shift and says it should not be considered an escalation by Russia. However, the Kremlin has issued stern warnings to the West about any F-16 transfers, with Russian officials explaining that the U.S.-made warplane could carry nuclear weapons and presents a strategic threat to Moscow. Ukraine plans to store the planes on the territory of other NATO states, and Russia has threatened to strike those facilities. Additionally, some members of NATO are preparing to send their own troops to Ukraine to train local forces. Earlier this month, President Emmanuel Macron said France is working to finalize a coalition of NATO countries that are willing to send troops. Moscow has stated that any French trainers deployed to Ukraine would be legitimate targets of the Russian military. Russian President Vladimir Putin recently blasted Western leaders for placing the world on the brink of a larger war. He said, "Ultimately, the selfishness and arrogance of Western states led to the current extremely dangerous state of affairs. We have come dangerously close to the point of no return, calls to inflict strategic defeat on Russia, possessing the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, demonstrates the extreme recklessness of Western politicians. And so Putin made those remarks in a speech at the Russian Foreign Ministry, where he also said some other interesting things that I want to get into here. So this article I wrote on Friday for antiwar.com. Putin makes public peace offer to Ukraine. So Putin laid out 4 conditions for Ukraine that he said would lead to an immediate ceasefire and ultimately the end of the conflict. According to the Kremlin, Kiev's neutral, non-aligned, non-nuclear status and lifting of all Western sanctions are necessary conditions for ending the conflict. So in a speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on Friday, Putin said that if Ukraine withdraws its forces from the 4 regions annexed by Moscow, that's Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, then he would order a halt to operations and begin negotiations to end the war. And we also did get some clarity here that, is something that hasn't, I don't think, been clear up until this point. Russia is, and Putin wants to annex these regions, but in their state-drawn lines by Ukraine. And so, maybe this is easier to imagine, say, somewhere in the U.S., take a state like Illinois, or yeah, it's probably a good one, right? Where most of the state's red, but there's a large blue concentration, right? And so let's say somebody annexed Illinois, but not Chicago, right? Or they controlled all the red areas, but not the blue areas. And they say, oh, we annexed this. And you kind of do wonder if it applied to the actual state drawn line, so the whole state, or just, what Russia controlled and where the main Russian population was. And Putin is making it clear that it is the state drawn lines that he's annexing all of this. So, as well as recognizing Russia's territorial claims to the formerly Ukrainian regions, Putin demanded that Kiev never join NATO or obtain nuclear weapons and called for an end to Western sanctions on Moscow. The offer is the second from the Kremlin in recent weeks and comes at a crucial time in the nearly 2.5-year conflict, as Moscow's forces made slow but steady gains in the Kharkiv region to offset Russia's advantages. Kiev's Western backers have significantly escalated their support to Ukraine, and we talked about that support in the last article. So the Ukrainian presidential advisor, Polyak, quickly rejected the Russian offer in a post on X. He said there are no new peace proposals from Russia, and Putin has voiced the only standard aggressor set, which has been heard many times already. Its content is quite specific, highly offensive to international law, and speaks absolutely eloquently about the incapacity of the current Russian leadership to adequately assess realities, where I think kind of that last part is projection. So the offer is similar to what Russia demanded in the early months of the war. At that time, Moscow was only seeking to annex Crimea. However, Russian forces have made significant advances in the years since, and the Kremlin says it will not relinquish the 4 regions of southern and eastern Ukraine annexed last year. Kiev's demands for ending the war include a complete withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine's post-USSR borders. Putin facing international trial for war crimes and reparations for war damages. Ukrainian President Zelensky will push this format at an international summit hosted by Switzerland, and more on that coming up here. So this one from Will Porter, antiwar.com, June 16th. Ukraine's war backers hold peace conference. So officials from more than 100 countries gathered in Switzerland over the weekend to discuss ways to end the conflict in Ukraine, devising a peace formula even as Western leaders continue to flood the battlefield with weapons. The conference kicked off on Saturday, where delegations from the U.S., Germany, and France and scores of other states met to consider how to achieve a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. However, a joint communique issued by the participants on Sunday offered no new proposals, instead repeating generic statements about Ukraine's territorial integrity and the principles of sovereignty. In place of a workable peace plan, the joint statement outlined 3 basic points regarding the safety of nuclear facilities in Ukraine, the importance of food security and the global supply chain, and the need for exchange of prisoners of war. It went on to reiterate past United Nations resolutions calling for an end to the conflict. Ahead of her speech at the meeting on Saturday, U.S. President Vice President Kamala Harris announced an additional $1.5 billion in aid for Kiev. This includes funds to rebuild infrastructure, $379 million in humanitarian assistance, and another $300 million to support civilian security. The new package follows the over $50 billion in military assistance already supplied throughout the war, including long-range missiles, main battle tanks, and other heavy weapons. While Russia was deliberately excluded from the peace conference in Switzerland, the joint statement nonetheless said that peace requires the involvement and dialogue of all parties, suggesting concrete steps towards diplomacy at an unspecified date in the future. The communique did not elaborate on what steps might be taken, though Ukrainian President Zelensky said a peace plan would be transmitted to Russia once it was finalized. The contents of that proposal are yet to be seen, but Zelensky has repeatedly called for an immediate end to hostilities and a Russian troop withdrawal from Ukraine's pre-2014 borders. The Kremlin has rejected those terms outright, however, instead urging Kiev to vacate four regions recently seized by Russian forces and give up its territorial claims to Crimea and agree never to join NATO. Noting Moscow's conspicuous absence from the meetings, a number of countries refused to sign the final statement, with the Indian foreign minister saying it did not associate itself with any communique or documents emerging from this summit. The Foreign Ministry in India continued, "We continue to believe that such a resolution requires sincere and practical engagement between the two parties in the conflict, and that the conference only was to facilitate a lasting peace and peaceful resolution to the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy." Other nations and territories also declined to endorse the document, including Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Colombia, Libya, and the Vatican. In its own statement, an Indonesian representative stressed the need for consistency in applying international law and said Russia must have a role in peace talks. Also worth noting here that President Joe Biden skipped this summit to be at a fundraiser with Barack Obama. All right, next up here, documents. Putin was willing to compromise to end war in 2022. So, in April 2022, Ukraine and Russia were on the brink of signing a deal to end the war just weeks after it began. The New York Times published documents showing Russian President Vladimir Putin was willing to make concessions to get the agreement signed. According to the documents, Putin initially sought to have Kiev recognize Moscow's 2014 annexation of Crimea. However, a draft agreement from April 15, 2022 suggests both parties were prepared to set aside the issue to end the conflict. So paragraph 1, article 2, 3, and 4, 5, and 11 of this treaty shall not apply to Crimea and Sevastopol, the document said, so Ukraine would not have been forced to recognize Russia's hold to Crimea. In December, a Ukrainian negotiator explained that an agreement was reached in the spring of 2022, stating the two sides managed to find a very real compromise. We were very close in the middle of April of 2022 and the April of 2022 to finalize our war with some peaceful settlement. Kiev was also willing to accept neutrality with regards to NATO, according to the New York Times. Ukraine's negotiating team proposed a peace deal that would say the country does not join any military alliances and does not deploy foreign military bases and contingents. The draft deal would also have allowed Kiev to sign bilateral agreements with NATO states, as well as become a member of the European Union, but would have required Ukraine's security partners to lift sanctions on Russia. So the U.S. could have, said, okay, Ukraine, this sounds good. We're going to sign a bilateral security deal with you that would just require the U.S. to lift sanctions on Russia, something that, I don't think the U.S. was very likely to do. So the Kremlin sought to protect the rights of millions of Russian speakers living in Ukraine by forcing Kiev to repeal restrictions on the Russian language and to bar the state from erecting monuments glorifying neo-Nazis and World War II era Nazi collaborators. And this article in the New York Times, one of the reasons I wrote this up for antiwar.com was just how much propaganda was shoved in here. So if you read the article, it says that Russia was trying to ban Ukraine from erecting monuments to its independence figures. And that doesn't sound good. And then you read the actual text of what Russia was trying to get Ukraine to agree to, and it does specifically lay out that they're worried about Nazis and the neo-Nazi collaborators. So, as the talks were ongoing, Ukrainian President Zelensky was pushed by his Western backers to forego diplomacy and attempt to forcibly expel Russian troops from his country. Then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson made an infamous trip to Kiev to pressure Zelensky to abandon peace negotiations, while Washington repeatedly vowed to supply unlimited military aid. The New York Times report added details about U.S. pressure on Ukraine to ditch the talks. According to a senior American official familiar with the negotiations, Washington quietly said to Ukraine, "You understand this is unilateral disarmament, right?" Additionally, the New York Times noted that Polish leaders believe the French and German governments might have endorsed the peace agreement and pushed Ukraine to accept it. So, during a meeting of NATO ministers in late March of 2022, the Polish president pressured other NATO leaders not to allow Ukraine to sign the Russian proposal. Some U.S. officials cautioned Ukraine not to trust Russia and warned that the talks were merely a military ploy. However, 2 out of the 3 Ukrainian negotiators that spoke with the Times believe that the Russian proposal was genuine, and one explained that Putin had reduced his demands over the course of the discussions. Ultimately, decision makers in Kiev listened to their supporters in Warsaw, London, and Washington and elected to break off negotiations. More than 2 years later, the conflict drags on, with Russian forces steadily advancing on Ukrainian cities despite renewed Western military aid. On Friday, the Russian president extended a public peace offer to Ukraine that is similar to the one nearly agreed to in 2022. However, along with Kiev agreeing never to join NATO and the West lifting sanctions on Russia, the Kremlin is now demanding that Ukraine recognize Moscow's sovereignty over Crimea and 4 regions of Ukraine that have been annexed by Russia throughout the 2.5-year-long war. All right. Let's get into some news about Gaza here. Israel claims to open aid corridor near Rafah. So, Israel announced on Sunday that it would pause military operations during daylight hours along a 7-mile stretch of road in Gaza to relieve the backlog of aid shipments. After the announcement, a top Israeli official downplayed any shift in military operations. So, the Israeli Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, COGAT, said the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, would begin daily tactical pauses near the crowded city of Rafah. And so their statement said, a local tactical pause of military activity for humanitarian purposes will take place from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. local time each day until further notice along the road that leads from Karim Shalom crossing to the Salah al-Din road and then northwards, I think maybe to the Indonesian hospital or the European hospital. This is an additional step in the humanitarian aid efforts that have been conducted by the IDF and COGAT since the beginning of the war. So, however, the IDF spokesperson, Rear Admiral Hegarty, downplayed the significance of COGAT's announcement, saying there is no cessation of fighting in the southern Gaza Strip and the fighting in Rafah continues. Also, there is no change in the introduction of goods into the Gaza Strip. This access carrying the goods will be open during the day and in coordination with international organizations for the transportation of humanitarian aid only. And I think to some extent, this was already going on. Not that Israel was necessarily publishing and drawing maps, but aid agencies did work and coordinate with the Israeli government on roads they were allowed to travel on at certain times of the day where they weren't supposed to be shot. Of course, oftentimes they were shot at, and a lot of aid was destroyed. We've had flower massacres and just numerous cases of Israeli forces firing on aid and destroying aid and things like that around Gaza. So this comes as virtually all major aid corridors into Gaza are either closed or severely restricted due to Israeli military activity. President Biden's temporary aid pier constructed along Gaza's coast was disabled again on Friday due to poor weather. The lack of food and other supplies in Gaza has dropped to dangerous levels. In the month following the Israeli invasion of Rafah, which shuttered Gaza's border crossing with Egypt, only 68 trucks entered the strip per day. That number marks a low point for the past 8 months, or at least near it. I think there was a couple weeks in February where it was under 20, but I think as far as a month goes, this is probably at or near the lowest average for an entire month, and falls well short of the 500 trucks a day the UN says need to enter Gaza to prevent disaster. So, the World Health Organization chief told reporters on Wednesday that a significant proportion of Gaza's population is now facing catastrophic hunger and famine-like conditions, and UNICEF has similarly warned that about 90% of children in Gaza lack nutrition and face severe threats to their survival, growth, and development. The COI statement follows a new round of U.S. sanctions on an Israeli group known as Taz-9, which has violently attacked aid trucks attempting to reach Gaza, while Washington has sanctioned a handful of Israeli citizens over their actions in the occupied territories. The White House has allowed Tel Aviv to kill over 37,000 Palestinians without change to U.S. support for Israel. So, next up here, Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir oppose army pauses in part of Gaza. This is from Connor Freeman at antiwar.com. So, following the announcement by the Israeli military and COGAT on Sunday that there will now be an 11-hour daily pause along a road in Gaza, Prime Minister Netanyahu said the plan is unacceptable, according to an Israeli official speaking with Reuters, and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who leads the extremist Jewish Power Party, said whoever came up with the idea is a fool and should be fired. So Reuters reported when the Prime Minister heard the report of 11-hour humanitarian pause in the morning, he turned to his military secretary and made it clear that this was unacceptable to him. Subsequent announcements from the IDF forces have reiterated that the brutal military operations in Gaza will continue apace. In order to facilitate the aid deliveries, the report explains that within the areas from the Karim Shalom crossing to Salah al-Din Road and then northwards, there will ostensibly be a pause in fighting from the hours of 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. local time each day. This highlights one of the ongoing disputes between factions of Netanyahu's far-right coalition and the military. Former defense minister and General Benny Gantz, the chair of Israel's National Unity Party, quit the emergency government and called for elections this month over his view that Netanyahu is preventing Tel Aviv from achieving true victory in the Gaza war. Despite the full-blown famine and starvation crisis wreaking havoc in the besieged enclave as a result of the Israeli onslaught and blockade, the Israeli leaders, ultra-Orthodox and Jewish supremacist allies, fear that too much food, medical equipment, and other aid is getting through to the desperate Palestinian population. Amid the mass slaughter in Gaza and severe restrictions on aid entering the Strip, far-right Israelis, mostly settlers, have been blocking aid shipments to the enclave, as well as destroying foodstuffs, including by deflating aid truck tires and setting the goods they carry ablaze. Additionally, Lieutenant General Hazi Havali said the head of the Israeli military insisted Sunday that there is a definite need to recruit more troops from Israel's ultra-Orthodox student community who are politically powerful and have subsidized by the citizenry of Israel and are exempt from the military draft. I think pretty much everybody in Israel has to serve except for the ultra orthodox community. A contentious bill that moved ahead in the Knesset last week, which could see a gradual change in the policy, potentially beginning a process whereby some ultra-Orthodox Israeli students would face conscription, as hundreds of Israeli troops have been killed and thousands wounded in the Gaza Strip ground campaign. This has led to protests in the streets of Jerusalem by ultra-Orthodox Israelis and threatens to ultimately collapsed Netanyahu's coalition. The prime minister's extremist right-wing partners are emphatically opposed to this overall, but some voted for the measure, hoping to change it during further reviews, readings, and committee hearings. Gantz and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant voted against the bill, with Gallant saying it is insufficient to meet the needs of the Israeli military. Some media outlets described a day of relative calm after the Israeli tactical pause was unveiled. However, throughout parts of Gaza, the IDF reportedly murdered more Palestinians, including children. Despite Sunday marking the first day of the Muslim holiday Eid, the most important Muslim celebration of the year, Al Jazeera reports that IDF razed homes in Rafah and attacks there continued. An Israeli attack on 2 homes in a refugee camp in central Gaza killed 9 people, including 6 children, according to the Palestinian news agency Wafa. Concurrently, in a separate attack, at least 2 Palestinians were killed in Rafah's western neighborhood, where last month a massacre took place after the IDF dropped U.S. supply bombs on a tent camp, wounding hundreds and burning 45 people alive, including mostly women and children and elderly Palestinians. According to the outlet's Arabic correspondents on the ground, the IDF then followed up this latest assault on Sunday by targeting an ambulance trying to reach the victims. Since the war began, roughly 37,300 Palestinians have been slaughtered in Gaza by the IDF, along with more than 85,000 wounded, and still thousands more missing, buried under the rubble, and presumed dead. So, now onto the pier. This one from Will Porter, June 14th, antiwar.com. CENTCOM moves aid pier and halts aid deliveries. So the U.S. military said it would temporarily locate its portable pier used to assist aid shipments into Gaza, noting that it would be moved to Ashdod, Israel during the present bout of rough weather. The decision comes after the United Nations paused its work with the pier due to security concerns linked to an recent Israeli commando raid. So U.S. Central Command, that's CENTCOM, announced the move in a press release on Friday, saying that relocating the pier would prevent structural damage caused by the heightened sea state and ensure that future aid deliveries, and added that the pier would be rapidly re-anchored along the Gaza coast as soon as possible, but offer no timeline for when that may occur. According to the Pentagon spokeswoman Sabrina Singh, aid deliveries for Gaza will be held in the staging area on the shore while the pier is moved. The decision was likely prompted after poor weather conditions caused at least $22 million in damage to the floating pier earlier this month, forcing the military to tow the structure to Ashdod for repairs. The pier is reportedly not capable of taking on waves larger than 2 feet. The latest CENTCOM announcement came days after the UN World Food Program, the WFP, said it would pause all operations involving the U.S. supplied pier to conduct a new security review, citing a June 8th Israeli military raid in the area, which left more than 270 Palestinians dead. The assault successfully freed 4 Israeli hostages held by Hamas, but saw IDF troops depart by helicopter from a site near the mateship pier. Tel Aviv and Washington insist the pier played no role in the raid, but the incident nonetheless stoked concerns about the security and neutrality of the aid effort. So this is UN humanitarian chief Margaret Griffiths, and he said, "You can be damn sure we are going to be very careful about what we assess and what we conclude." He added that if the agency found Israel had used the beach or roads around the pier improperly, it would put at risk any future humanitarian engagement in that operation. A UN spokesperson clarified earlier on Friday that the WFP was still unable to resume its activities with the pier, stating that the organization was still working to ensure the security conditions for humanitarian work can be reestablished. And this means that essentially all the routes into Gaza for aid are not now cut off, even though that one wasn't going to do a whole lot. All right, next up, here's an article I wrote on Friday for the antiwar.com. U.S. sanctions Israeli group attacking aid shipments. So the U.S. blacklisted an Israeli organization for interfering with aid shipments headed to Gaza. The group, Tabs 9, demands that no aid enters the strip until all Israeli hostages are released, and uses violence to curb deliveries of humanitarian assistance to Palestinians. The organization operates in open view of Israeli security forces and is also supported by top officials in Tel Aviv. In a press release published on Friday, the State Department described Taz 9 as a violent extremist Israeli group that has been blocking, harassing, and damaging convoys carrying life-saving humanitarian assist to Palestinians in Gaza. For months, individuals from Taz 9 have repeatedly sought to thwart the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza, including by blocking roads, sometimes violently, along the route from Jordan to Gaza. On May 13th, 2024, Tab's 9 members looted and set fire to 2 trucks near Hebron in the West Bank carrying humanitarian aid destined for men, women, and children in Gaza. Taz 9, or Order 9, refers to the call-up letter that Israeli reservists receive when they are ordered to go to active duty. The group receives support from Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has ordered police to leave the aid trucks unguarded. National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, said the U.S. has repeatedly brought up the interference with aid shipments to Tel Aviv. Israelis have obstructed aid trucks since the days following the October 7th Hamas attack. The blocking of humanitarian convoys has become more problematic since Israel attacked Rafah in early May and shuttered Gaza's border crossing with Egypt. Now, most aid enters Gaza comes through Jordan and must cross the West Bank, giving Taz 9 ample opportunities to interfere with the meager supplies allowed into the strip. The group demands that Tel Aviv stop all aid from entering Gaza unless Hamas releases hostages, and has various methods to prevent aid from entering the strip. Since October 7th, Israeli civilians have held protests to prevent aid trucks from passing. However, Taz 9 has also used violent means, including looting or destroying shipments, setting aid trucks on fire, and even attacking the drivers. Taz 9 is just part of a broader Israeli network that prevents assistance from reaching Gaza. Tel Aviv has implemented an onerous inspections regime for the trucks entering the strip that slows the process and blots life-saving aid deliveries. Additionally, Israeli forces have routinely attacked aid workers, trucks, and warehouses within Gaza. The people of Gaza are in desperate need of the aid that is being blocked by the Israeli government and private citizens. The World Health Organization told reporters on Wednesday that a significant proportion of Gaza's population is now facing catastrophic levels of hunger and famine-like conditions. UNICEF warned that 90% of the children in Gaza lack nutrition and face severe threats to their survival, growth, and development. The U.S. has previously sanctioned 13 Israeli settlers for their violent attacks on Palestinians. However, the AP report that this was actually counterproductive, stating that the measures had a minimal impact, instead emboldened settlers as attacks and lab grabbed escalated. So they actually got more violent in response to the sanctions in the past. So while Joe Biden has taken some minimal steps to rein in Israel's behavior, he continues to supply the IDF with weapons. The arms shipments act as a green light for the Israeli onslaught in Gaza, which killed over 37,000 people and reduced much of the strip to rubble. All right, everyone. That's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Of course, I just have so much I'm trying to get through for you guys. It's going to be a very busy week as I'm filling in along with Connor, Jason, and Will for Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, writing up news stories. So definitely keep an eye on antiwar.com, and I'll continue to put out episodes every day. Thanks, everyone.